Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this seminar by Radboud Reflects. My name is Chile Tempels. I'm Program Manager for Radboud Reflects. And today we're going to continue our series on the war in Ukraine. And today we're going to talk about the geopolitics of war and specifically the role of the EU within the conflict and how it perceives it, how we're going to deal, how it positions itself within the conflict. We'll talk about sanctions, migration, and the global balance of power. And we'll be doing that with Reinout van der Veer. He's political scientist and assistant professor of European integration. And in his research, he focuses on governance within the EU and EU decision making. And he recently published an article on the sanctions of the EU of when Russia invaded Crimea. So he's an expert on the topic. We'll be listening to him for about 30 minutes or so, and then there's again room for questions from you. So without further ado, I give the floor to Reinout.
Thank you very much, Chida, also for the invitation. And it's great to see so many of you here, some familiar faces. I guess it really shows the importance of the topic that we're talking about today. And I've also just found out that there's even some people here that have recently left Ukraine. So I'm going to really try and do justice to this story, even though I've actually never visited Ukraine. So what I want to talk about to you about today is the geopolitics of the war in Ukraine, and I'm specifically going to focus on the role of Europe, and especially the role of the European Union. And this is also because that is really my expertise. So this is what we're gonna be talking about an EU perspective, basically, on the situation. So a perspective from the EU, but also a perspective on the EU and the geopolitical situation in Ukraine. If you have any questions, I want to ask you to save them for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll get to them. I'm going to find a better spot to stand. So this is the overview of what I want to talk to you about today. I want to very quickly give you a little bit of a brief history on how we got to this point. So I'm going to talk about the geopolitics of the European continent from basically World War II onwards. It's going to be very brief, but it's going to be a setup to talking about the relationship between the EU and Ukraine, and also the relationship between the EU and Russia in the recent history. And then I want to look at the current situation and look at, so what do we know from the recent history? What's currently changing in the situation that we're seeing developing as we speak, and what might that then maybe hold for the future as well. So to start with this very brief history, and I know that there are some students of mine here that have taken theory and history of European integration. I'm really going to apologize. I'm going to keep it really, really brief. But to understand the geopolitics of the situation, we do need to go back a bit. So the key story of European integration and the European continent is that basically the political organization of the European continent has always been very much driven by geopolitical change. And one of the biggest changes in recent history, of course, was the end of the world wars, but especially at the end of the Second World War. Because, so here you can see German divisions marching around in Paris in front of the Arc de Triomphe. And especially this end of the Second World War was a very interesting geopolitical period with a lot of geopolitical uncertainty as well. And there were two big developments that are relevant for today that came out of this. First of all, 4 years later, in 1945, we get the signing into existence of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You will all know this as NATO. This is an alliance with the Western European states and also the other side of the Atlantic, so the US and Canada. It's a security alliance very much based on hard power and sort of, well, basically you know the story of an attack on one member is an attack on all, so that's, you know, this whole idea of deterrence. The other big development that we get shortly after that is in 1951, which is the creation of the European coal and steel community, but you will know this as the predecessor of the European Union. This is also an important development because basically this is the other part of the future of the European security architecture, the European Union, which is a very different organization from NATO in that it focuses much more on soft power, so cooperation between its member states, but also especially cooperation with the region and the rest of the world, especially trade, for example, and aid. But make no mistake, the fact that they started with coal and steel was very deliberate because those were the two main resources that states in Europe had used to wage war on each other. Prior to that, they were also very important in the reconstruction of post-war Europe. So the idea was if we can get them to cooperate on coal and steel, then we might build lasting peace on the European continent. Now what we then end up with is this. For the first time in history, we no longer have European superpowers and all their colonies basically deciding on world affairs, but we get what's called a bipolar international system. And this is a system that's basically split in two. We get the West as we know it today, US-led, NATO is a big part of that, but also the integrating European states in the European Union. And we, on the other side, we get this Warsaw Pact, so the USSR, the Soviet bloc. And this setup will basically, and you can see also here, it runs right down the middle of Europe, this divide. And this setup is basically the way that the geopolitical situation on the European continent, what it looked like for the next 4 decades or so. Then I'm really going to jump forward very quickly because there's another major geopolitical shift. And this is then the breakup of this big red bloc that we just saw. So in 1991, we get the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to talk to you about specifically what led up to that too much, except that you should know that Germany is reunified at this point. But so the Soviet Union collapses, and what this means for this European geopolitical situation is that suddenly we get a lot of Eastern European countries that used to be within Moscow's sphere of influence. So they used to be in the Soviet bloc, but they basically become unhinged and they become free to decide their own geopolitical future. And this leads to a very big wave in 2007, in 2004 actually, a big wave of applications both to the European Union and also to NATO membership. So all the orange countries here and these same countries here apply both to the European Union and to NATO. So we get a big extension and what Putin would like to call basically NATO and the EU creeping eastwards. Now, this is basically what the EU looks like today. This is basically what NATO looks like today. So you can see that this was a major turning point again, but this is sort of the decider for what the European continent looks like today. You can also see that Ukraine, which is what we're going to be talking about today, did not make it in this big wave of Eastern accession to NATO and to the EU. Now, that has a few reasons. And so, why is Ukraine then not in the European Union? Well, there are a few reasons for this. Ukraine has always wanted, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has had the ambition to join the EU and also the ambition to join NATO. But Ukraine has had a long road ahead of it in terms of meeting what they call accession standards on rule of law, democracy, human rights, stuff like that. So even though Ukraine has been making progress, it's never quite made it far enough. But there have been different ways in which the EU has been engaging with Ukraine since the breakup of the Soviet Union, especially two basically economic and political cooperation arrangements, the so-called Eastern Partnership, which also involves other former Soviet states that didn't make it into the EU, and the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. Now, another reason why Ukraine didn't make it into the EU, and this one is very relevant for today, is that it's actively been, or at least Moscow has been actively trying, and especially Putin has been actively trying to prevent the EU accession of Ukraine. And so there's a few key moments in this story is first of all that in 2010 we get a pro-Kremlin government in Ukraine, the Viktor Yanukovych government, which is actively stalling basically Ukrainian progress towards EU membership because it's trying to keep Putin happy. And what this also means is that a lot of people in Ukraine get fed up with this Yanukovych government and decide to kick him out. This happens during the Euromaidan protests, which you see here in 2013 and 2014. And these protests were very much the setup, basically, for the situation that we have today, because once Yanukovych is kicked out, and we get Poroshenko, a more pro-European or pro-EU president and government, Russia immediately responds by annexing Crimea, and the war in the Donbass is started. Now, a third reason why Ukraine didn't make it in is because, especially from this century, beginning of this century onwards, the EU itself, and also NATO to some extent, has been incredibly inward-looking. And this has to do with a number of things, but mostly a series of crises, from a financial crisis to a migrant crisis, a refugee crisis, and then of course we had Brexit. This all really damaged the legitimacy of the European Union. It led to rise of populist parties, Eurosceptic parties in Europe, and that also very much, especially this migration crisis, led to this idea that, the European family is large enough, we do not want any other members in it. And so this also really hampered Ukraine's prospects of EU accession. And of course, we get in 2016, this is our contribution to the conflict. We, or a very small portion of the Dutch population, votes against this association agreement. And it's also when we get this guy entering the political scene. This was basically his major, his sort of persona really took flight because he was a key player in this campaign against this association agreement. So that's why Ukraine isn't part of the European Union. Now, let's look at the EU-Russia relationship. And Russia is really a foreign policy challenge for the European Union. And again, there's a few reasons why this is. First of all, the main reason is Putin himself. Putin has a very particular view on what he thinks Europe should look like. He thinks the collapse of the USSR that we talked about earlier is the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And this was the topic of last week's Radboud Reflects lecture. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I do want to plug this book called Putin's People, written by Catherine Belton, who is she's a Financial Times former Russia correspondent. And this book really nicely lays out basically Putin's rise through the KGB ranks in Eastern Germany all the way up to the top of the Russian political system, and how Putin and his KGB friends have basically since then tried to prepare the Russian state to take on the West. Second reason why Russia is a foreign policy challenge is very simply that even though it's not that economically powerful or large in terms of economic output, it's comparable to Spain, or a very popular comparison people make is Russia is roughly the same size as the Benelux if you look at GDP. But it has the second largest army in the world, and it has the largest nuclear stockpile. And so this makes head-to-head conflict, military conflict between the West and Russia a very dangerous thing, and also, for a very long time it made it a very unlikely thing. The third reason is economic interdependence. So the European Union and Russia have for a very long time been extremely linked to each other by all sorts of ties, especially economic ties. And it is at this point that I'm going to bring in a little bit of theory, which I hope is okay for you, because this really is important in the story of why Russia is a foreign policy challenge. And it has to do with what these three authors call weaponized interdependence, or the weaponization of interdependence. So, weaponized interdependence, they define it as a condition under which an actor, a state, can exploit its position in an embedded network to gain a bargaining advantage over others. So it's about using your position in a network to basically influence other actors in that network. And so states can weaponize networks to choke off economic and information flows, discover and exploit vulnerabilities, compel policy change, and to deter unwanted actions. So I guess you know where I'm going to go with this. This is the idea that you can actually wage war on each other without firing a shot by using all sorts of other means to put pressure and to coerce the other party by whatever ties you have with each other. So this has led basically to roughly the last 2 decades have been characterized by hybrid warfare between the West and Russia. And so especially Russia, but also the EU has been weaponizing different ties in different ways. One thing that Russia likes to do is weaponizing political ties, also political information. You can talk about disinformation, of course, but I really like these pictures because you can see how close the far right in Europe, which is, anti-establishment, sort of destabilizing, that's what they want to do. They want to sort of, they have all these ideas about leaving the euro and leaving the European Union. This is Matteo Salvini, the far-right leader in Italy, with a Putin shirt, thumb up in front of the Kremlin. So it gives you a sense of the relationship. And there's also been a lot of funding going from the Kremlin to far-right and far-left parties in Europe. And this is all Putin's idea of, putting pressure on the EU, destabilizing the EU. There's also some evidence to suggest that Putin was a big funder of Brexit campaigns. Second, what's been going on is the weaponization of economic ties both ways. And so we see this basically by the use of sanctions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But also, we are extremely energy dependent on Russia. So that's why if you currently are driving a car, you're paying about twice the amount for gas because of our dependence on Russia in terms of energy. But again, these ties, Putin has often threatened to cut off the energy supply to Europe. We are doing the same by canceling Nord Stream 2, for example. Third reason, or third way you can weaponize stuff is other ties, such as migration. And this, you might remember, towards the end of last year, we had this refugee crisis at the eastern border of Europe, where suddenly we had people from the Middle East appearing at the Baltics. And we had no idea why this was happening, because it's not a very usual route for them to take. Turned out Lukashenko was basically flying planes into the Middle East to pick them up and then to drive them to the Polish border and say, well, there you go. So this is another way in which Putin and Lukashenko have put pressure on the European Union. Last one is cyber attacks. This has been going on for quite a while, but you might remember the time when the Dutch intelligence services actually foiled an attempt to hack the chemical weapons watchdog, which is located in The Hague. So hybrid warfare, weaponized interdependence, has very much characterized the situation between the West and Russia so far, and that is all because we disagree on a lot of things, but we do not want to use our military force to try and persuade the other one into doing something else. So, where does it leave us in the current situation with this conflict in Ukraine? What is sort of similar, or especially what has changed now that Putin has decided to go for this all-out invasion of Ukraine? Well, there's a few things that changed. Especially in terms of the West, Europe, what we're seeing is a remarkable show of unity between parties that were, in very recent history, not very much on the same page. So the UK, of course, leaving the EU in this Brexit saga, but also you might remember we had the Orange Man in the White House not too long ago, and we were having trade wars with the US. But what we're seeing now is basically they are all on the same page, and they are very much all, coordinating. They're flying all over the place to talk to each other, and they're basically on the same page in terms of how to respond to Putin. Second, we have seen a lot of this weaponization of economic ties so far, but what we're seeing today is really unprecedented. I mean, we're talking about, directly sanctioning Putin and Lavrov, which is something that's, we've basically never done before, except I think for Saddam Hussein and really people that we label as war criminals. We've also kicked a number of Russian banks out of the SWIFT payment system, also very much an unprecedented move, and we had no idea, what the impact was going to be. We're going directly after Russian trade, but also the US, for example, has decided to stop importing Russian gas, which is also very much a first. We've even closed all of the European and also US airspace to any planes from Russia, which is now actually a problem because there's a lot of European planes in Russia and Putin doesn't want to give them back. We've also, again, major shift. Europe has never been a very large military player. We've had NATO for that, but we're seeing stuff that we've never seen before, especially in the way that Europe has now, the EU is now using funding to buy and send weapons to Ukraine. So instead of non-lethal aid, we're now also giving lethal aid, which is very much a first. And we've seen a historic shift in German foreign policy. Germany has always been, especially given its legacy, of course, has been very much reluctant to be too interventionist in geopolitical situations. But we've now seen basically a complete U-turn in Berlin, and this really also opens up the prospects for doing much more in terms of collective defense at the EU level. Because France has always very much wanted this. Germany has always been one of the member states that was more reluctant. And as my students will know, once Germany and France want something, it usually happens. So what does this then mean for Ukraine? Well, first of all, I don't think Putin expected the Western unity on this and all the aid that Ukraine is receiving. And so what this means is this invasion has been dragging out for much longer than Putin had intended. I mean, there's this very famous example of this very long column of 60 plus kilometers of military vehicles that were just out of gas, out of food, just sitting on their way to Kiev. But this also means that Russia is resorting to increasingly brutal tactics. So there's been kidnappings, there's been attacks on civilian targets. There are reports of Russian soldiers shooting at civilians that are just in a line waiting for bread. It's really becoming quite grim. And there's even been talk of the use of chemical weapons. We're also, this is something that's going on very much today. Yesterday, we're seeing that Ukraine and Russia are negotiating, and they didn't really go anywhere for quite some time. But I think Zelensky has yesterday basically signaled that he might be willing to talk about Ukraine never becoming part of NATO if that helps find a solution, which is a big thing if he was to promise that to Putin. What does it mean in terms of EU accession? Well, I think I have some bad news for Ukraine there. So first of all, I think the question would be, if we're talking about EU accession, which is always a more sort of a longer term process, I mean, we don't really know what will be left of Ukraine in a few weeks. We also don't know who will be in charge. So it's a very uncertain issue. But even then, we already know that if you want to have a new member state, you need unanimous support, and there are countries that are currently not willing to take Ukraine in, our own prime minister being one of them. So what does it mean for Putin's Russia? Well, first of all, I mean, these unprecedented sanctions that we're putting on Russia right now, again, unprecedented really means we've never seen something like this before, so we're not really sure what the effects are going to be. I mean, the effects of the previous rounds of sanctions were relatively soft. It's also because sanctions are sort of a long-term tool, so you don't expect immediate sort of impact. But I think the sanctions that we've seen now, for example, kicking these banks out of SWIFT, you can see already in terms of economic prospects for Russia is that it's going to be very severe. Russia has also built its economy, or Putin has been preparing the Russian economy to weather sanctions by, for example, buying a lot of foreign reserves. So not being reliant on the ruble as its own currency, but having, for example, a lot of dollars helps him sort of, evade some of these effects. But we've also seen that the first predictions of a Russian default were for yesterday. It hasn't happened yet, but if the IMF is saying something like this, we might really be seeing severe economic consequences for Russia in the near future. We've also seen anti-war protests in Russia that have been going on for quite some time, and some people have put some sort of hope on that, maybe that, we'll see internal political change in Russia, which might change the situation. But I also have some bad news on this count. All the evidence of studies of sanctions so far suggests that there may be some rally around the flag effect. So this is 2014 when we put sanctions on Putin, and the idea is that, we sanction a country to signal that we do not really agree with what they're doing. And so you would hope that maybe if we sanction Russia, that Russians think, well, what's going on? Why doesn't the international community like us? Is there something going on? And should we be criticizing our leader? Instead, we see the opposite. So we see that sanctions and this war really, basically gave Putin a popularity boost. And so the question really is what these new tougher round of sanctions will do in terms of that. And I mean, just to give you some more evidence of this, 58% of Russians approved of Putin's special military operation in Ukraine a week after it's been launched. And this is also quite interesting, and this tells you something about, how effective the Kremlin propaganda machine is that Russians' early sort of reports here suggest that, okay, Russians see McDonald's disappearing, they see their chai lattes disappearing from Moscow, all the Western companies are leaving the streets, and what they do is, a lot of Russians think, well, this is just the West trying to get us. It's not related to what Putin is doing in Ukraine. So they're not really making the causal link between the effects of the sanctions and Putin's leadership per se. Now, this is one I haven't talked about yet, but I thought it would be interesting because China is, of course, the third key geopolitical player on the world stage. And so the question really is, so what about China? Well, China is very ambivalent about the situation in Ukraine, and this has to do with a few things. China doesn't really mind Putin and his pushbacks and his sort of assaults on the liberal order that the West has built, because China is not exactly a fan of that liberal order either, especially not being a democracy. And we've also had our gripes, of course, with China. So that's something that China and Russia can agree on. But at the same time, what the Chinese do not like is the Russian disregard for the territorial integrity of sovereign states, so in this case Ukraine. And this is very specifically for one reason, that is that China itself has quite a few secessionist movements within it. So you can think about, for example, about Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, but also Tibet, for example, where, the Chinese are worried that this might set a precedent. Putin's support for a secessionist movement in Russia is something that the Chinese are very worried about. But the third point, and this is really a key point, China is very sensitive about trade. I mean, we all trade with China. All our products come from China, and China has a lot to lose in this situation. Russia is a declining power, a declining economy. China is a rising power. So in terms of, the possible fallout of this conflict for China, that can be really severe, and that can really also hurt the Communist Party's long-term plans. So I think I'm about 30 minutes in. I just want to leave you with some final thoughts and maybe some input for discussion, some questions that I'm currently walking around with, and I think we should all be talking about right now in terms of the relationship between us, the European Union, and these actors. First of all, should we really, and this also ties into a broader debate about rule of law in the European Union. We have currently our issues with some of these Eastern member states that joined in 2007 and their respect for the rule of law in Europe. We've got some issues there, but we're also talking about bringing Ukraine in, which is very much also in terms of progress towards democracy is on a comparable level. So on the other hand, you can also say, well, the Ukrainians are really fighting for this European dream. So why can't we bring them in sooner and then we'll sort out that issue later on? So how important is democracy and rule of law as a condition for membership in these Western organizations? Especially we've got Viktor Orban in there as well. Second, should we be accepting Putin's sphere of influence? Or his claims that he has a sphere of influence and basically that Ukraine is his backyard. Because what Putin is still doing, and this is about these negotiations that are currently going on, is if Zelensky gives in to Putin's demand that Ukraine never joins NATO, what we're essentially, if we allow him to do that, we're essentially saying, okay, Putin, you were right. You have a sphere of influence and you have a say in Ukraine's future, even though you don't live there and you're not the president of Ukraine, right? So this is about the right of sort of self-determination for Ukraine. At the same time, what can we really do about it, right? Because he has this nuclear stockpile, and are we really willing to go further? But this is a question that I have, do we even have a red line? So, if I'm going to be very cynical, what amount of war crime or what amount of genocide is enough for us? Is there an amount of genocide where we say, okay, this is too much? The ICC is currently ruling on this. I'm not calling it. We really don't know what's going on in detail in Ukraine, but we are seeing all this evidence of really atrocious stuff happening, right? But we're still letting it happen. So do we even have a red line in the West? And then lastly, in terms of China, I think this one is quite interesting. China is currently sitting on the fence, but is it just a fence sitter? Is it a kingmaker in that sense that, China hasn't really decided which side it's on, but if it decides to join the Russia side at some point, we are in big trouble. If it decides to join us in pushing back against Russia, we would have a much easier time, right? And this basically the saying in Dutch where two dogs are fighting over a bone and the third one runs away with it, this really much speaks, I think, to the other possible outcome that this might all have for China. I think I'll leave it here. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this.
Thank you, Reinout. Sadly, we're already out of time, so we have to wrap up for this afternoon. Thank you for being here, for your questions, for your comments. We'll be continuing the conversation next week on Thursday when Alfons Brunning, theologian, church historian, will talk about the religious side of the conflict. And afterwards, in the week after that, we'll be having a lecture from someone from the legal department as well. So I hope to see you there. With regard to China, there will be a program on Xi Jinping's China on the 21st of April. You can also go there. But for now, I would like to thank you for being here and Reinout for your valuable lecture. So thank you and see you next time.